Hi, good morning. My name is Zakaria. I've met some of y'all. Haven't met many of y'all. Excited for this opportunity to share some of what we've been working on, share this alive, moving, emerging thing that we're calling Survival Bloc. A little bit about myself. I live in Virginia. I live in Virginia. Um, I got connected with ISC through last year's ISC intensive. Um, Excited to see all the ways that things are growing this year. I was kind of born as an activist in the climate movement, originally doing fossil fuel divestment work on my campus. Um, and I think something that we share, and speaking for myself, is a lot of where our kind of analytical framework, some of our, you know, praxis and experimentation is coming out of like confronting the limitations, the very intrinsic limitations to the U.S., the dominant U.S. climate movement. And that was my own experience of politicization, is less so what the climate movement taught me, but more so what I found to be insufficient to confront something as big as the climate crisis. So we're in this kind of, I feel like I'm in this liminal space where I've rejected and moved outside of the boundaries of that movement, but there isn't yet something that is kind of formed to really encapsulate what I think we are confronting, which is the era of climate survival, and what strategy for social revolution will look like in that era. Y'all following me? Cool. Oh, and I'm a farmer. That's what I use. That's what I do with most of my time back in Virginia. So Survival Block, really, like I said, this is the first time we're giving this workshop. We haven't even like fully rehearsed, or I don't even know exactly what days he's going to be talking about, because that reflects the fact that, and Maria and Gabby, that reflects the fact that this is a living thing. It's something that if you asked us 3 months ago, we would have different answers. But in its core, I think what Survival Block is ideological intervention, and an analytical framework, and a series of living experiments that we're starting to incubate and create in different places, mostly in the Southeast right now. So in that sense, my job in this workshop is to define some of those ideological interventions and that framework that we're using, so that my friends over here can actually start to get into some of the concrete stuff we're actually trying to do and what it can look like. So in that respect, we see survival as a process held in common, and we see prepping, and we approach prepping in a social lens. So I think I want to ask y'all, like, what is the typical connotation or imagination of the prepper in our society?
Bunker with guns and cans of food.
Bunker with guns, cans of food. God, do I have to use the mic? This feels a lot better.
Yeah,
It helps a lot for
virtual folks.
Okay,
You
I'll
can
do
can
it.
also
around
take off.
Yeah, you can take it off.
Oh,
background.
that's good. Say again. Bunkers of food.
An unnecessary amount of guns.
Unnecessary amount of guns. What else?
Individualistic.
Individualistic.
White supremacy.
White supremacy.
For white people.
White people. What else?
seeing other people as your enemy.
Seeing other people as your enemy. Monopoly on resources. Can you say more?
Individual people having a lot of stuff that they can afford and other people can't.
Yeah, like my friend over here said, individual people trying to hoard a lot of stuff. I mean, I think we all saw that in the early days of COVID, of just like stockpiling toilet paper and whatnot.
A weird obsession with MREs.
A weird obsession with MREs. What's an MRE?
Like,
Meal
like
ready.
survival food, like
Military meals.
Military meal.
yeah, just the military in general.
Cool. All right, so we got the vibe, right? And similarly, like, even that's like our connotation in mainstream thinking of what a prepper is or what prepping means. And similarly, like I was a fan of Survivor when I was a kid. And a lot of our, I think of like movies like I Am Legend and the TV series Survivor, where, you know, it's really about this like lone person surviving some kind of apocalypse or crisis, right? So that's the first thing I want to say is that I don't think that it's a difference of values that we are injecting, where it's like, well, we value cooperation and collectivity, so we see prepping and survival in a cooperative and collective manner. I think we have to take a step back, and depending on what we perceive to be the crisis that we are preparing for or we expect to survive, our sense of what prepping and surviving it follows from that perception of what that crisis is, right? So in that sense, I want to start by disentangling conceptually the different connotations of crisis so that we can actually see into this thing that is just, you can be in a room with 100 people who are talking about climate crisis, and they might all be thinking different things and what that will look like and how that will form and what that means, therefore, for how we can prepare for it, right? So, lots of words. So this is non-exhaustive, and also I want to emphasize this is a way of conceptually disentangling them. The point here is not to talk about things in objective reality, assessing those. The point here is to create synergy with shared language and concepts so that we can have some shared subjectivity in the process of this workshop. So starting with the capital C crisis, okay? AKA capitalism. But really what I mean by that is this is the long crisis. And when I say long, I mean across generations and eras over the last 4 centuries. And the long crisis, the capital C crisis is a long crisis in motion that produces, shapes, and seeks to manage all crises towards its own stabilization and reproduction. Then kind of zooming in beneath that, we have what a lot of people will commonly connotate as crisis, which is our social and political crises. So these are the specific manifestations of crisis produced by the needs, machinations, and underlying irrational rationality of capitalism. So think health crises, crises of houselessness, the climate crisis or climate disasters. Typically, when we talk about crisis, we're zooming in to this particular connotation of it, which is that we live in a society in which crises emerge and need to be solved or confronted one by one or kind of with individual movements and struggles. That neglects the fact that it is the society itself and the system and structures that produces our modes of being and animates our activity and means of exchange and existence that is itself producing a crisis and is a disaster and crisis in itself in motion. And then, of course, we have the climate crisis, which is the human-driven catalyst of a geological epoch defined by radical shifts in the Earth's systems, within which organized human history emerged as we know it. And then finally, we have our acute climate and ecobiological crises. So obviously, hurricanes, forest fires, these are the moments that it's where this is the phenomenon as we experience the climate crisis as humans. It's in these moments of acute crisis. But again, in reality, there's a inextricable entanglement of all these crises, right? As we've already been saying, it's not like these are different crises and that emerge independently of each other, but they're utterly entangled. For example, when a hurricane strikes New Orleans, it's as if on my farm when it rains, there's not an equal dispensation or dispersion of where the water actually pools, right? The landscape itself defines the phenomenon of that storm, where there's dips, there's puddles. So when a hurricane hits a place, it's not an even distribution of that phenomenon. The phenomenon as we experience it is defined as it is manifest through the medium of our existing social landscape, political landscape. A heat wave doesn't just have an automatic effect on people universally or uniformly. If there's a crisis of houselessness, I was just in Vegas, in the west side of Vegas, where I've been to places outside of the US, and even the degree of houselessness and desperation in that sense that I was witnessing was like severe and profound. The phenomenon of the heat wave, it manifests through the kind of social landscape where people don't just die because there's a heat wave. People die because there's a heat wave and they don't have a place to be. That's just an example, and we're all smart enough here. Most of y'all are smarter than me, so I won't have to talk about all of the entanglement. But the point here is to be able to see the kind of dimensions of crisis so we can think what it means to survive and prepare. How we doing? Are there other thoughts about entangled nature of some of these crises? How are these crises kind of like in reality fully overlapping and inextricable? That's my way of allowing myself to refer to my notes. 15, all right. 20? Damn. Thoughts?
How about the inherent like racism of migration, where people who can't afford to move somewhere can't have to stay where they're at?
Exactly. Exactly. I don't know if everyone heard, but when we talk about climate migration, again, that's assuming that everyone has the means, the social mobility, the economic and financial positionality to choose and opt into migrating. I mean, again, COVID and even now, we're seeing this. Like, people were able to escape the cities in the immediacy of COVID who had the money and social mobility to do so. Similarly with people who are in the zone of habitual yearly forest fires. Who's going to be left behind? Go ahead.
Maybe the co-emergence of the climate crisis and the rise of authoritarian right-wing, anti-immigrant,
Yep.
xenophobic movements.
Yep.
And then adding to what we were just saying, a lot of the indigenous reservations are being mined and exploited and poisoned their waterways and their soil as well, and they don't have the means to leave. And that's their ancestral home.
I think about folks with disabilities, especially disabilities that we see as physical, but also we don't talk about the mental disabilities, and like what that looks like in a crisis. It's much more of like a non-overt kind of like consequence where someone that does have like a mental disability, and there's like a spectrum of that, right? Like for example, like me having ADD, going through like some type of crisis like that, the way that I heal and move through that looks very different from someone that would be considered neurotypical, and it prolongs other problems beyond the crisis.
I appreciate that. Yeah, my mom's in a wheelchair, and whenever I have an imagination of a version of crisis, the first thing is like, what, I can't leave that aspect of it. What does it mean to survive and help the people I love survive? Go ahead.
Yeah, all those affluent people moving to particular places to get away from COVID had a devastating effect on some of the places they moved to, where all of a sudden life was unaffordable, housing was unaffordable,
Great.
and continues to be.
So that's exactly. So like one of the interventions I'm trying to pose right now is, I remember like in the climate movement, there was this kind of argument of like, the climate, it was almost as if the climate movement was up here, where it's like, look, all of these other things we need to, they're crises. Like we know like racism, all these things are immediate crises that need to be approached. But if we don't solve the climate crisis, then it doesn't matter. You know, we have to do that first, and we have to be able to, you know, this was the kind of line that was being said. And if we don't approach the climate crisis and create a movement in which everyone is first and foremost focusing on it and mitigating that crisis, then we won't have a reality, we won't have a world or a means of existing to struggle against these other crises. And what we're talking about right now is like climate mitigation. If we understand the threat of climate crisis and climate disasters as something that only manifests within our social landscape, and the social injustices, the social content, the kind of economic landscape as well. Wait, I lost my thought. Let me start over. Right. So if a climate event, if a natural disaster only manifests through that medium, then we can see these fronts of struggling on the basis of racial justice, et cetera, as climate mitigation. Because there is no abstract climate event that then just manifests and has a immediate and automatic threat and toll onto people. It only manifests through our social texture, and that texture defines the effect and the phenomenon and the threat of death and harm and et cetera of that crisis. So when we were in Vegas, Maria's going to talk more about that in this historic Black community. Something we were talking about is dealing with the kind of entrenched racism in that community is climate mitigation. It mitigates the effects and the unnecessary toll and dimensions of the threats that climate crisis poses. But the real point is to get into strategy and not just analysis. So returning to these categories, I want us to start to move into like analyzing hegemony, essentially. So for example, social and political crises. What kind of bodies, institutions, organizations are demonstrating leadership in approaching and solving the crises? I think first of NGOs, social services, state-run social services. That's what else when we think of these kind of crises.
You mean like FEMA and such?
FEMA, yeah. Churches, yeah.
United Nations.
United Nations, yeah. The WHO.
World Health Organization.
The World Health Organization, yeah.
The band is an important institution. What are you talking about?
So something that we're trying to illustrate in a kind of a lens of our focus with Survival Bloc is specifically thinking about the acute climate and ecobiological disasters or crises as moments of strategic significance. I wrote down yesterday, let me pull it up. Gabby, how much time do I have?
You got like 11, 12 minutes.
Cool. So yeah, like I'll start with the anecdote. I remember when I was about 6, there was a blizzard. I grew up in DC in Maryland. And there was a blizzard when I was about 6 years old. And I have this vivid memory of, you know, no one could go to work. No one could get to the cul-de-sac of townhouses where we lived. And I remember that week was so fun because there was a neighbor with a generator and we all had meals at their home because they had electricity, you can power a stove. And suddenly this like place where I knew my neighbors back then and was friends with their kids and whatnot, but we were like a community in this way. And it had this like, it stuck, you know, that memory stuck with me. And I think that's honestly a fairly mild version of an acute kind of climate or ecobiological crisis. Obviously, COVID is a much more major expression of one of those acute, I would say, ecobiological crises. But as opposed to the kind of static nature of, yes, there is a crisis of racial injustice, and yes, there is a crisis of houselessness, but there's these institutions and organizations that already exist and are moving to approach and address them. I think what happens when we have something like a climate event, a forest fire, or a pandemic, or a hurricane, things change. And I think hegemony has weaknesses. So some of the things I wrote down yesterday were it inflames, in the moment like a hurricane, it inflames the intensity of existing social crises and the need for immediate solutions for the people who are unhoused in those moments, for example. It exposes practical limitations and interests of the existing hegemonic instruments of leadership and governance. Think Katrina and how the relief organizations and police turned their guns on certain people and saved other people, that exposed the actual interests in that intense moment. It activates agency. You know, it's hard to get people to go to a meeting on a random Tuesday, but in the moment where survival is an immediate kind of reality, everyone is looking for solutions and often looking towards each other. It obviously typically correlates with a rupture in the kind of mode of everyday life in this hegemony of capitalism, which is you wake up and you wake up with the mundane crisis of I don't have enough money for rent, and you go and spend your days and weeks trying to seek out that money through wages or extra economic activity. Suddenly that reality is suspended for a time, like the pandemic when it was suspended for months. And it activates the practical basis of local and even hyper-local organizing. Suddenly, you don't have to tell someone it's important to organize at the level of the block when a crisis hits your city. You know, you're looking directly towards who's right next to you, like the person with the generator, you know? And I think it also activates a practical and immediate confrontations with the limitations and fictitiousness of social Darwinism. There's theories around collective or analysis around like disaster collectivism. What we are told is that in our instincts is competition, and it is the society that delivers us into a state of organization and unity. And if that society were to collapse or were to break down, think the movie The Purge, immediately it would be like robots that are activated back into our like original state of just like kill or get killed, you know? But are people familiar with Kropotkin, who's also I haven't really read him intensively, but from what I understand, he kind of counterposed Darwin's scientific theory that was based off of studying species in Costa Rica, Costa Rica is a place in which there's high biodensity. It resembles a place like where Darwin lived, which was industrialized London or England. When you analyze that place, you can perceive and observe competition. But when Kropotkin was analyzing places like a tundra, where cooperation was just as scientifically observable as a basis of survival amongst and between species. So these acute crises, we would say, is moments where social content, consciousness, and concrete needs outpace and breach the capacity and sophistication of hegemonic recuperation and absorption. These are moments that our strategy are not based on, but moments in which we can become active and lead through crisis. If we lead through crisis, I think we can start to, not when I say we, I don't mean like this cadre of us who are going to like be the like new institution that is telling people how to go and move, but the we that Mason was talking about, the power, all power to the people, all the time. That's the we. So I'll wrap up. I have like 5 minutes. Bet. So we're gonna start getting into what that can look like, you know, what it actually means to prepare, not just for these moments, but to move beyond these moments, not just to survive so that we can see the future, but survival of the base as a necessary matter of our reality that we have to really engage with in order to build a future. We will have to survive while we build that social revolution. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something that I was thinking about. Like when crises happen, I think like people definitely like will reach for one another, and I just wanted to kind of mention like the nuclear family is so like antithetical to this idea. I feel like if people are just like, you know, in their own boxes, like in their own houses, and they're like, all I care about is like me and mine, like my husband, wife, and children, then like when disaster, you know, strikes, you're so isolated. And I feel like with like the storms that they had in Texas, like I feel like that's such a you know, a part of the country that's very individualistic and has that as part of their kind of culture, and like so people are so far apart. And it's just like, it's very sad to me that a lot of people have suffered because of that separation in that particular case, and I think that's true in a lot of cases.
Word.
We're gonna get into that.
Right.
So I'll just close with, I'll try to set an alley-oop for you to dunk it, Maria, but a little D-Wade to LeBron, you know what I'm saying? The last thing I wanted to say, I could have, if I had more time, I would make sure I made the kind of analytical steps towards this, but something that I've been kind of feeling in our space is like, which is really exciting me in the dialogue that we're having, is we're kind of starting from the assumption that what we're trying to do is revolution, and that's the only way. You know, that's the only, ultimately, that is the horizon. There's no version other than through a social revolution. But what's exciting to me, unlike other kind of tendencies I've been a part of, have expressed myself, and am growing a little bit weary of, is then we start by like being like, so let's build it, like this, like we're ready, we have to like be prepared for the revolution that will come tomorrow. And then we just keep like failing and failing and failing. And we're all on the same page here. The horizon is that. The horizon is that. But right now, like, where is the horizon? Can we see it? There's a big ass mountain in front of it, right? So we can kind of like get a sense of it. We can look towards and reach into a void to understand what that horizon might look like, but we can't fucking see it. There's this mountain right here, and if we are only ever thinking about the mountain that delivers us to the flag on top where we've kind of conquered and made our final victory, we'll keep on marching towards it and running into that mountain over and over again, right? So there's not a contradiction between this. There's not a contradiction between knowing that we're headed towards the horizon, but knowing that the first thing we need to figure out is how do we get up that mountain? What tools do we need? What resources do we need? How many people do we need to be working with in order to do it? Then maybe one day we will. I think we will. Not maybe. We must get to the top of that mountain. And then we'll look out and we'll realize there's 4 more mountains, a river, some quicksand, and a woods filled of ugly ass pigs that are gonna try to attack us. You know, and then we're like, oh shit, I thought, damn, all right, so let's hike back down. We need at least 100 more people, because if we move forward with the 20 of us, we're fucked, you know? So we'll hike back down, but we figured out ways to navigate that mountain. And now more people come and make it to the top, and they see it too, you know? And then maybe one day we'll be like, we're ready. Let's now approach the next obstacle. So I think what we really need to do in this time is to really look at the mountain. Look at that mountain. Look can we get up? What is that mountain? You know, is that mountain the police, or is that mountain social atomization, our mental health? Is the mountain like the kind of common kind of the capitalist class? Or is that mountain the fact that we have no productive sovereign capacity in the communities that we're trying to mobilize? We need to start with the things that are the immediate obstacles so we can actually start to understand and see and conceive and perceive the horizon that we're headed towards. And what's beautiful about, what I like about that metaphor is you never arrive at the horizon anyways. It's always somewhere further ahead. So we will never arrive at that destination, but it is a way for us to orient our path forward. And the more we move forward, the more we see into a further horizon. Thank you.
Hey y'all. Is this a better mic? Is this a better mic?
Yeah. You can take it off.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna take it off. Okay, how are we feeling? Really? Oh, nice. Okay. I feel like the topics we're covering are pretty like sad and dismal, so I want to take a deep collective breath together. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Executive, for laying an analytical foundation for the rest of the presentation. But I'm going to be sharing more about who we are and some of the strategies that we're kind of like experimenting with and getting y'all's input and facilitating discussion around that. So I want to first start off by introducing our group, Survival Bloc. Just to kind of share how we kind of started organizing together, I want to share more about like my personal organizing journey. So I started organizing when I was in college. And I've kind of organized on basically a lot of different kind of issue areas and movements because honestly, I never understood why like our social justice groups were kind of insulated from one another, like immigrant rights, racial justice, like sexual assault advocacy, like everything was like so insulated. So I feel like my approach to that was kind of like trying it all out, organizing in a lot of different kind of contexts. But the one space that I avoided the longest was actually the climate movement. And it was just because of how white it was. Like I was like, this is just the least kind of like, I don't know, racially, economically informed movement in the US, the mainstream climate movement. And I started getting interested in the why that was because when I was a senior in college, I was kind of like, why is it that the mainstream climate movement, that was like around the time of the height of the Sunrise Movement. How many of y'all are familiar with the Sunrise Movement? Yeah. So that was around the time of that, and I was just like, I definitely saw the importance of having like a mass movement, and I felt like they were doing some shit that was like good, but I was also like, why is this so white? And so I kind of started doing research on the mainstream environmental movement and why it's so white, and like racial and class barriers to participating, and kind of studying the lineage of the environmental justice movement versus the mainstream climate movement. Um, and I myself never participated in the Sunrise Movement because I just never thought it was just very top down, very focused on federal policy. Um, but I did have some friends that did participate. Um, Daisy was a leader in the Sunrise Movement, and there were other people who participated. And I started meeting other kind of young people of color who were in that movement who had very traumatized experiences with it, and were like, I feel used, and like this was like, yeah. And that was super interesting. Um, and I actually met someone, and this was kind of the origins of Survival Bloc. I met someone who used to be the creative director for Sunrise, Alex, if any of y'all know him. Um, and that was at the time that I was working with the Power Shift Network, if y'all have heard of them. And I was helping kind of organize their most recent convergence in New Orleans. If y'all haven't heard of him, it's like a BIPOC youth-focused climate network. And I was in that network, and I was just like, just kept grappling with the fact that even though I had been trying to participate in like so many different spaces that were like, even the ones that were kind of like approaching climate from like young leaders of color kind of approach, like it still felt like nothing was enough. Like nothing felt like it was like landing, that had a strategy that actually like felt strategic and realistic. Um, and I met Alex, and he was talking about how like we're in an era of climate survival, and that was really important for me. For some reason, I feel like even though I was in the climate movement, I was like denying that to myself, like, which is kind of funny to kind of deny the level of crisis that we're facing. So we had like an evolution in our thinking. We kind of started, we formed like probably like 2 years ago, we started talking. Um, and we had kind of like an evolution because we had been so socialized in this kind of like non-profitized movement type of organizing that we thought in order to achieve kind of what we're thinking, which in the broad realm is like building mass-based climate survival programs, that was kind of like our initial orientation. We realized like we had been indoctrinated with like an approach that was very top down. Like we needed to like front load a movement and then disseminate it from the top down, like how all the mainstream climate organizations and other organizations too like approach mass movements from the nonprofit context. And we were like, that doesn't seem right. And that's literally what we're trying to fight. But we were like, okay, so what are we doing? We're building the basis of something that is a movement, not building a movement, then disseminating it. And we know we do need a unified strategic strategy rooted in mass movement. But the past years, we did a lot of reflection, and we were like, how come the kind of like uprisings that we've had the past few years, like the 2020 uprising, the current uprising for Palestine, how come they haven't been considered legitimate forms of protest by these nonprofits, and have been like more co-opted than anything into like more focus on policy channels than in like sustaining those forms of riots and uprisings. So that was a question where like, how come we do have movement? Those uprisings are some of the only glimpses of movement that we see in the US. And yet a lot of kind of the nonprofit organizing, professional organizing kind of sees that as not legitimate and trying to co-opt and repress it intentionally and just through the structures that exist. And it felt like through that conversation and reflection where we're kind of like landed was like, we need to create systems and engines that can propel those kind of uprisings from continuing rather than delegitimizing them. So I have a question for y'all. I'm curious. This hasn't come up so much in my conversations so far here, but I'm just curious, like in y'all's experience, like the past 8, 9 months, there's been a genocide in Palestine, and we've seen so much mass mobilization. Obviously, I'm sure as y'all probably have critiques of like mass mobilization as a form of effective organizing, but I'm just curious for the kind of work that y'all are doing in your respective areas in kind of more this type of like social ecology and like that kind of community organizing, like how has it interfaced with the uprising for Palestine? Like has it felt like disconnected from it? Have y'all felt like it's been like like that kind of uprising has been connected to forms of like assembly and kind of like solidarity economy and mutual aid? Like I'm just curious to hear from a couple people.
So in general, I would say it's tough sometimes to draw that connection. But I'm very lucky that in my case, one of my organizing projects is a cooperative called The Strange Matters. It's a media publication, a magazine, and we were able to put out a very good essay by Mason, like relatively early on in the war, arguing explicitly that it was genocide and sort of like, you know, directed towards a left-wing audience, but also towards a decently growing non-converted audience, you know. So, I mean, it's probably, you know, it's media. It doesn't change the world, but we created an assembly democratic structure to create this platform that the movement against the genocide, like other movements, can use to sort of signal boost. So we signal boosted, for example, the Tacoma occupation. That made it into the essay and pulled the media blackout about it. So you know, we kind of put that out there.
Cool, thanks for sharing that. Does anyone else have reflections? Yeah.
I was part of a climate justice movement that decidedly have separated itself from the genocide, as in there's not much we can do in terms of that, and we need to stay focused on our messaging, avoid controversy. Uh, well, that that first injected me with despair and losing hope, as in like if we can't be in solidarity or opposing genocide, then are we serious about anything we do? Are we just part of a non-profit industrial complex invested in maintaining the status quo and staying and not interested in winning? But luckily, this despair turned into finding other spaces where you can mobilize, radicalize, and organize with co-workers. So the No Tech for Apartheid movement was the new space where energy would go to, and then building the local chapter in Seattle for No Tech for Apartheid, and then also trying to envision what in the future this chapter could do for the community, as in like fighting all forms of apartheid, technology, and surveillance of fascism, and providing tech skills for local movements as well.
That's awesome. But yeah, your original kind of story about the climate justice organization, that resonates, I feel like, with probably a lot of people. Like, I feel like I saw this was a whole like political thing that nonprofits had to figure out what was strategic for their Zionist funders, and it shaped the whole like kind of discourse in professionalized organizing. And somehow that was like such a big part of organizing in the U.S. It's hubbed in the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to that. I was also in the same boards and also fighting for apartheid. I also found that like one of the most like hopeful organizing things that I took part in was this like 25-mile march for Palestine. It was like literally organized by a bunch of people who'd never done any organizing before, and they managed to create an event that was like very like focused on like disability justice and like solidarity with Palestine, like making sure that things are accessible, making sure people are safe, like community care and like teaching each other safe, like all of these things very much like incorporated into like this movement, and also indigenous lands, and like we stopped at the like Duwamish Longhouse and like on the the descendants of Chief Seattle like and talk, and like it's this very very integrated sort of approach. Nobody was a threshold organizer, like nobody had done any of this before, so like they didn't have any of that sort of like institutional baggage. I think kind of like oh no, we can't do that because like our funders wouldn't like it, or like oh no, we can't do that because we have our plan, we have the process, we're gonna do the process, you know. And I think it's just way more interesting and impactful to like do these very like kind of localized like intersectional like actions than it is to just like try to focus on like reproducing an organizational structure, you know.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna pass it to Gabby just briefly. Gabby is organizing with us in Richmond and has been a leader in the Palestine Solidarity Movement.
Hey, what's up, y'all? Yeah, I just wanted to share a story or a short anecdote to respond to Maria's question too about what we're doing in so-called Richmond, and like the huge clash that's been happening lately between like people like you said that are very very used to like the institutional nonprofit organizing clashing with like more like anarchist, autonomous organizing that has been extremely difficult to navigate, like especially in the Palestine sphere. Like a short example is a lot of like older people tried to create this like coalition that was kind of out of nothing and were systematically excluding people who hadn't like signed on to an imaginary platform, and it became this giant clash that was really in my mind spurred by people who were just really really used to the nonprofit kind of structures, and they were like, you know, unconsciously or consciously recreating it in our attempts to like consolidate and like I guess get everybody together in one space who was doing this same type of work. It's almost like they're unable to work with people outside of that framework, and it seems that like the mindset that you get when you work in nonprofits for a long time is really hard to break. And yeah.
So we're gonna be talking about the nonprofit industrial complex in a second and talking to each other about it actually. But just for the sake of time, I know that was like not that much time to dig into a big question, but I hope we can do it the next few days. Um, so that's one thing, right? Talking about uprisings, why they're not considered legitimate forms of movement, and how they're co-opted and interface with the nonprofit industrial complex. So I just want to put that aside for now. We're going to get back to it. The original kind of vision of Survival Bloc when we came together was kind of reflecting on the most radical movements in global history and US history using a method of dual power. And specifically, we were super inspired by the Black Panther Party survival programs. And that's kind of where our name and our idea of survival programs, climate survival programs, comes from. So when we first started scheming, we were like, we need survival programs of this era. And that's what we can start with. We need that, we need that for masses of people. But we also know that we're dealing with way different political conditions, economic conditions in the 60s. So actually a funny story is me and Zakaria went to the last Institute for Social Ecology in Detroit, and we met with two Black Panthers, Janina and Lorenzo. Shout out to them. And started getting some mentorship for them after the intensive for Survival Bloc to kind of get into the kind of weeds, like what they were kind of like, what we had to deal with, y'all have to deal with way more. Like y'all are dealing with so much shit. Like so, like just keep that in mind. And we were like, okay, we need to dig into this. Like what is different about that time? What is the wisdom from the Black Panther Party survival programs that we could infuse into this moment? And so we asked them questions like that. And there was obviously many things that they mentioned, like the rise of mass incarceration, the rise of homelessness, all as intentional kind of things that the state has done. Specifically, what was interesting is like them talking about the rise of the nonprofit industrial complex after that era as a way to intentionally kind of repress, co-opt, and segment revolutionary movement. So that's what I'm hoping we can get into in a sec. So that stood out to us, like kind of recognizing that and kind of making that kind of assessment of being like the nonprofit industrial complex is intentional, and it is in the way that it is structured, not in the sense of like individual nonprofits, because I also run a nonprofit. So So it's not in that sense, but in a structural way where it is like an enemy. And we have to kind of be smart about that in our strategy, like how we're interfacing with it. And the other thing that they mentioned that was very interesting and we reflected on in our conversation with them was about the rise of economic precarity. So they talked about how in the 60s, a lot of the Black Panthers, they had like different kind of networks of like different like housing and land projects where they would like, even Janina was saying that she would spend like most of her time doing organizing for the Black Panther Party and could survive like economically doing that because of like the systems of solidarity that existed, and also the fact that economic precarity wasn't as intense then as it is now. Um, and I feel like that was very interesting for Survival Bloc to reflect on because we had started our visioning kind of thinking we need mass-based survival programs, like kind of similar to that era. We need it for the masses, like. And when we started reflecting, we were like, damn, like everyone we know who's like young and especially person of color, but also just like generally is broke and literally like barely has time to put time into like revolutionary organizing. Like that's like because of our economic precarity, we're barely surviving. And we're kind of pretending like that's not part of our work to address that. We're just like, we need to keep going and we need to keep going. And like, we're just getting more and more in economic precarious situations. And so that was a big shift that we kind of made in our own thinking. We were like, I don't think we're ready to start with mass-based survival programs. We kind of have to start with survival programs for literally for organizers. And I don't even mean that like organizers, like professionalized organizers. Like, I mean people who have the capacity and leadership to lead the revolutionary movements in our various localities. Those people need survival programs, like to have the time to start carving out the time to 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 then kind of like replicate that model and bring more people into it. And so that was a big kind of recognition we made in our strategy, and also thinking about this is kind of related to that, the crisis of community and movement that we have in the US. So I feel like a lot of people throw around community and movement, and literally, I don't know about y'all, but I don't see that much community or movement in the US. So I feel like that was another thing where like we're living in so much cognitive dissonance, and the Black Panthers helped us kind of assess that too. They were like, the 60s didn't just come because the 60s just happened. Like there were decades of organizing that happened before that, and that was the height of revolutionary movement. So the way that we should think about our struggle is that we're in a pre-decades era of creating the foundation for what could become a revolutionary kind of decade where those things are happening at a mass scale. And that was really important, even though that's a small thing, just to not live in organized and cognitive dissonance, like to recognize the phase of struggle we're in.
That was the dump.
What?
I said that was the dump.
So yeah, we have a crisis of leadership, of community, of movement, of visions. And we realized we need to address that before we're like, okay, we're gonna create a mass survival, mass movement. So yeah, just to transition. So there's two kind of focuses right now, I would say, of tactics that we're working on and experimenting with this past year. One is movement incubation, and one is climate survival programs. And those two things are connected. So I'm gonna share a definition of movement incubation and see what y'all think about it. And I'm gonna share an example of how we're working on this in actual real life too, but this is kind of the vision of it. So the impending ecological crisis and disasters present a unique, timely, and necessary opportunity to bring movement groups together to build shared alignment and vision. We know now more than ever that accelerating climate disasters will continue to impact every social justice movement until we iterate a new powerful vision that brings together a movement of movements for ecological justice that is stronger than any single issue movement will be in isolation. What will unite this movement of movements is the increasingly clear understanding that capitalism and colonialism have brought us to our current political moment of extreme precarity, inequality, disasters, and crises. And strengthening our struggles against these oppressive and extractive systems entails a unified and coherent strategy and vision across social justice issues and approaches. That's like the basic definition of what we mean by movement incubation. Does that make sense to people?
Yes.
Yep.
Do y'all have any questions or thoughts on that? I know that's pretty intuitive as a statement, but
Maybe I don't know if you're gonna go over kind of how to avoid when you are trying to disassemble these kind of segregated organizations, how to avoid getting kind of capitalized on or overrun by the nonprofit industrial complex.
yeah. No, that's a good question. So basically, we're kind of like in our first phase of movement incubation in Richmond, Virginia, and Louisville, Kentucky, and kind of in the early stage of starting it also in Westside, Las Vegas, Nevada. And we're kind of coming up against that. Daisy's kind of like a couple months into a movement incubation process in Kentucky that's bringing together leaders across social justice issue areas, mutual aid, environmental justice movements, labor movements, into kind of the shared space of strategy and reflection on the need for like a dual power movement. And I feel like Daisy's coming up against the nonprofit industrial complex. I feel like we're also, Gabby's kind of leading that process in Richmond, and we're coming up against the nonprofit industrial complex. And I feel like the critical thing there,
Showing their ass.
I'm gonna actually go into a case study later about the Vegas and how the nonprofit industrial complex is potentially the biggest threat at the moment to doing this effectively. So I think that's why it's so important to recognize that. Yeah. Is there any other thoughts on movement incubation?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is implicit, but like there wasn't a lot of mention of like intersections of like the way these systems are oppressive, like misogyny, misogynoir, like specific like Islamophobia, all these sorts of things that are like intersections that make these particular things worse. Like I guess one of the things that I sometimes like worry about in if we're just focused on like one or two kind of like structural level things that like the sort of what often gets dismissed as identity politics, but I feel like intersectionality is relevant. So yeah, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. So I feel like the definition I shared, I would say it's focused specifically on one kind of layer of this, which doesn't address what you're talking about, like addressing kind of like oppression based on like background and identity. I think what we're talking about with movement incubation is kind of like one layer of analysis that's talking about how to build kind of movement that we need in the localities we're based. We need to identify who's in leadership in like kind of like different types of social justice organizing and approaches and convene them. So it's kind of different from what you're saying, I think a little bit. But it would kind of be addressed through the kind of fact that we need to organize with groups and leaders who kind of organize in different issue areas, including around like those with based on identity and identity-based oppression. Sorry, I don't know if that addresses that question.
I don't know. I think I'll probably just keep contemplating.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I addressed that.
The purpose of bringing together like multiple groups and leaders is to do that intersectional work, you know. So if the goal is to really build like again like some of that rainbow coalition kind of work that was happening, where it's like if we do like the climate crisis is, for example, connected to reproductive justice, and in that kind of layer of movement work, you are going to unpack misogynoir. You are going to unpack patriarchy. So the goal is to bring these people into an intersectional manner to talk about that. Yeah.
And just so we're on the same page, as far as I understand, after lunch, there'll be we have more questions and answers, right? And the section after lunch is kind of group thinking about movement incubation, right?
I don't know. Me and Mace are gonna figure it out. But yeah, for the sake of time, I'm gonna move ahead. So the other kind of definition I want to share with y'all before we get into some kind of conversations with each other is around climate survival programs. So our goal for movement incubation as of now is focused on kind of like the launch of climate survival programs as the first iteration of experimentation. And the most simple definition of a climate survival program or survival program is that we want to allow more people to divest their time and energy from capitalism and into systems, economic systems, and other systems based on solidarity. So any kind of program that allows that to happen generally is in the bucket of climate survival programs. But I think for us, we're really interested in getting more sharp and strategic even within that bigger definition because there's obviously priority areas around which we feel like the climate crisis is kind of highlighting we need survival programs more than others. And those include food, energy, and water. And so that's kind of like things that we're trying to prioritize experimentation with. And the first round of survival program that we're piloting in Richmond this year is based on food. So we have a farm and we're growing food, and all of the food from that farm we're kind of providing, Gabby is assessing kind of leaders within kind of the landscape in Richmond that kind of fit kind of our criteria for who we want to support in that way with like free, healthy food and education and helping facilitate reconnection with the land for them and kind of knowing those people are people who need that to be able to sustain their revolutionary organizing. So we're in the very first stage of kind of experimenting with this. And there's a lot still that we need to figure out within these frameworks and parameters that we're setting. But I just wanted to share those definitions with y'all before we have some conversations. So I kind of want to go back to what we were talking about like survival of the organizers and why that's important, like, and the economic precarity we face in our life and how that's like, in some ways, the first step to addressing the challenges that we're facing in this era. So I feel like, I don't know about how many of y'all are connected or organizing through the nonprofit system? Cool, okay. Not everyone, that's good. I'm sure y'all are figuring out other challenging ways to make it work, to organize, make time for organizing. I feel like in my experience, when you start organizing, the wave, the current of the nonprofit industrial complex is so strong that immediately it's possible that your organizing becomes absorbed within that system if you need resources and you're trying to draw down those resources. So, and obviously there's so many issues with that. As I was talking about with the Black Panthers, like them talking about how the nonprofit industrial complex was intentionally set to repress our movements by kind of operating from the mode of, and the elite class making money off of people having the problem, rather than truly oriented on addressing the root cause of the issue. And also thinking about social justice areas as siloed rather than a cohesive movement. I feel like a lot of that comes from the nonprofit industrial complex. And also just like what we were saying about Zionist funders, how philanthropy shapes our movement. Even now, like I run a nonprofit, and this year our donors and our foundations don't want to give money to climate organizing. Like there's a downfall in the amount of funding because they want to give to the democratic establishment this year, and that's their priority. So a lot of these foundations and donors, they're aligned with the democratic establishment and the elite kind of interests.
Also want to add to that, sorry, really quick. Also, they're not giving any money because they already feel like the climate crisis has already been solved. Because of nonprofit messaging, of net zero, of getting corporations to sign on to climate pledges and stuff like that. They believe that the crisis has been averted. So,
Yeah. So I'm hoping everyone can get into a one-on-one with someone that you haven't talked with, ideally, or you don't know that well. And the question for reflection, I'm gonna give y'all 5 minutes for this in the one-on-one. I know that's short, but if y'all wanna. There's like another breakout that's longer. Okay. Is reflecting on, in your experience, how has the nonprofit industrial complex co-opted, repressed your approaches or thinking imagination of what is politically possible? You can address that question, but I know some of y'all aren't actually doing organizing in the nonprofit industrial complex, so I want to offer another take on this based on where your position, which is, what is your reflection on kind of like your capacity and energy and time to dedicate to revolutionary organizing, and how have you made that possible given the level of economic precarity we face, and what challenges are you facing in that? So yeah, if you wanna find someone, you haven't talked too much, and I'll set a timer for 5 minutes. Okay, I wish we had more time to discuss that. We could talk about that a long time. Was there anything really interesting that anyone wants to share, like briefly? Any highlights?
Yeah. Viv.
Yeah.
How the structure of needing like a board and kind of a centralized body at the head of an organization kind of requires you to centralize some amount of group power in a small amount of people.
I got an extra sheet.
Okay, we're gonna write this down because this is super interesting.
Can you also repeat the responses out loud?
Yes, okay, so you were saying that the structure of boards and nonprofits is
necessarily centralizes the power.
Yeah.
Kind of part of that, like to even handle money, open a bank account, you have to have officers, you have to have bylaws, you have to have all these things, even to just take in like a distribute. So you want to do it like completely off the books, but there's dangers in that too.
Yes. So they were saying that in order to even do anything within the nonprofit industrial complex, you have to have it super documented. There's upfront costs and barriers to that, and also the issue of surveillance from the state, obviously, and documenting everything you're doing and reporting back.
I guess that kind of attaches to it the mass use of procedure like Robert's rules as well, as kind of limits the free flow of ideas in meetings as and over structuralizes communication.
That inhibits what?
Organizing.
Organizing. Okay, got it. So basically sorry, I don't know if I fully got that actually.
So a lot of the rules and procedures in like actual meetings themselves, like Robert's Rules of Order, which I know a lot of nonprofits use, tend to inhibit communal decision making and communal communication.
Cool. Could you just briefly define Robert's rule?
Robert's Rules of Order?
Yeah.
It is a system of majoritarian procedure designed for meetings where everybody hates each other. Based off like congressional, basically how Congresses operate, and it's kind of terrible because he is anti-deliberative to an extent, and anti-consensus.
Yeah.
It's very anti-consensus.
Got it.
It also seems like just like the prescription that we get from folks that do go to college for nonprofit management, that is being relayed into our organizing. So because I know how to manage a nonprofit, I know how to organize my community. I feel like that's where that indoctrination comes from.
Yeah.
Like they learn that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So a lot of nonprofit, like I've have experience in like social services and everything, and a lot of it, and so much of my job has been about gatekeeping who gets benefits based on whether they meet criteria, whether we just sort of they need help or are qualified for it.
Yes. I don't know if everyone heard that, but gatekeeping, like social services and who things are distributed to. I think someone here was talking about how they were, I forgot what they are. They were doing humanitarian work in Ukraine, and they were kind of dealing with mutual aid organizations on the ground versus like humanitarian organizations, and that being a big issue. Yeah.
One of the themes that came up in our conversation was like the squashing of political imagination and creativity, both in like nonprofit organizing, and I would add also in like bureaucratic labor organizing that I've done, like not having the time or space to, or not even having a conversation about getting to the root of the problem. And I think, yeah, that can really just squash like everyone involved's political imagination. That like this is all we,
Yeah.
you know, need to do.
Yeah, squashing of political imagination. Yeah.
I think a lot about the saviorism, and especially for the millennial generation being told you need to save the world and professionalize saving the world, and then that becomes a way to keep you like handcuffed to capitalism because your identity is your nonprofit.
Yes. Yes. The issue of saviorism and professionalized organizing as an identity. Okay. For the sake of time, I'm gonna move us along, but these are really good insights. So I guess the reason I wanted to share that was because I feel like one of the interventions we want to make in our survival programs is the survival of the organizers is the first step to the survival of the masses. And we need to make it possible for people to invest their time in revolutionary organizing and divest from systems of capitalism without the only channel being the nonprofit industrial complex. So that's kind of one kind of layer. I'm gonna move along into another layer of analysis around this. So obviously that's kind of like within the level of like we need economic self-determination for people who are leaders and organizers. And that's really important and potentially like a first step in creating that in a bigger scale. The other layer of this that I want to present as an intervention that we're making in our organizing approach is that economic engines and infrastructure is more important than ideology in bringing people into the movement. So in order to do that, well, first I just want to share this quote. Capitalism is a sinking ship, but no one is going to jump until we get the lifeboats ready. How does that land with people?
Yeah, it's similar to the Brother Cabral's quote that you shared yesterday. People need options, not ideology.
Yeah, people don't need ideas, they need choices. This is another way of saying that. But it's basically getting at the idea that there is mass consciousness around capitalism failing us. That's not the issue that we're battling in this era. It's actually that we don't have infrastructure to bring people in and engines, especially economic engines, to bring people in. And we're kind of battling in the realm of ideology and conversations. And I guess one kind of case study I want to share is from this book, Hinterland. I don't know if y'all have read this book. It's really good. Y'all should read it. But I'm just going to read like 2 pages from it. Hinterland? And I'm just going to read 2 pages from it that talks about the framework of competitive control. Have y'all heard of competitive control before as a concept? No one has heard about it? Okay, well, I'm glad that I'm sharing it. It kind of helped me a lot. So this is a case study of competitive control. So in the midst of a far-right movement dominated by internet threats, spectacular street brawls, and run-off-the-mill white male terrorism, the patriot groups stand out owing to their focus of self-reliance initiatives. Faced with devastating declines in governmental services, many have stepped in to provide basic social services and natural disaster training. This is particularly notable in rural counties in states like Oregon, where the combination of long-term collapse in timber revenue and dwindling federal subsidies has all but emptied the coffers of local governments. In Josephine County, located in the Rogue River region of southwestern Oregon, the Sheriff's Department is able to employ only a minuscule number of deputies, depending almost entirely on federal money, and often cannot offer emergency services after hours. In 2013, the county jail was downsized and inmates were simply released en masse. In the rural areas outside of Grants Pass, the county's largest city with its own locally funded police department, the crime rate has skyrocketed, and the sheriff encouraged people at risk of things like domestic abuse simply to consider relocating to an area with adequate law enforcement services. In this situation, the Oath Keepers began to offer basic community preparedness and disaster response courses and encouraged the formation of community watches and full-blown militias as parallel governmental structures. They offered preparation workshops for the earthquake predicted to hit the Pacific Northwest and also volunteered for community service, painting houses, building a handicapped playground, and constructing wheelchair ramps for elderly or infirm residents. While often winning the hearts and minds of local residents, these new power structures are by no means services necessarily structured to benefit those most at risk. The Patriot Movement surge in the county followed a widely publicized campaign to defend a local mining claim against the Bureau of Land Management after the mine proprietors were found to be out of compliance with BLM standards. This sort of vigilante protection of small businesses, local extractive industries, and property holders, in particular ranches, is often at the heart of Patriot activity. And it is their skill at local organizing that makes the Patriots far more threatening than their more spectacular counterparts. The Oath Keepers also piloted the Patriot Movement's inside-outside strategy, within which local self-reliance initiatives were the only one slightly more direct tactic among many. This strategy puts an equally strong emphasis on inside work via formal administrative channels, facilitated by entry into local government and the Republican Party, in a way that synthesizes well with the outside work they do in defunded Timber County or along the US-Mexican border, where they prepare and establish parallel structures of power. While filling in the holes left by underfunded law enforcement in Josephine County, for example, Patriot-affiliated politicians were also leading the opposition to new property tax measures that would have allowed the hiring of more deputies. This, of course, helps to widen the funding shortfall further, helping extra state militias to step in and begin building their own power within the county. The Patriot parties thereby seek to extend and secure the economic conditions for their own expansion. Okay, this is the definition of competitive control. So the thing that makes the Patriots unique then is their recognition of the need to build power within these wastelands and their surprising ability to outcompete the dwindling state and local progressives in this endeavor. These groups are essentially engaged in a battle of competitive control, a term used by the Australian military strategist David Kilcullen in describing the rise of guerrilla forces within the interstices of failing states. Kilcullen argues that the success of insurgencies such as the Taliban in Afghanistan, as well as the rise of expansive criminal syndicates in places like Jamaica, can both be explained by the ways in which such groups succeed in providing a predictable, consistent, and wide-spectrum normative system of control that helps to win over a population buffeted by the chaotic inconsistency of economic and cultural collapse. By providing material incentives that guarantee stability, combined with threats of coercion for those who oppose them, such groups became capable of making the population complicit in their rise, regardless of ideological positions. In fact, Kilcullen points out that in such situations, support for one faction or another simply does not follow ideology. People don't throw their weight behind those they agree with, and often many in a population can't be said to have any deep-seated ideological commitment in the first place. Instead, support follows strength, and ideology follows support. Political or religious attachment is often an after-the-fact development preceded by the capable intervention of a pragmatic, functional group that begins as a small minority of the population. Okay. Sorry, I know that was a lot. Did that make sense? Okay. So I know we're kind of running late on time, but we're gonna have one more small breakout group. Um, and the question I have for y'all is, how does this framework, even if y'all don't fully agree with this idea of competitive control, how does this framework that they're arguing of competitive control, which is the idea that infrastructure, economic infrastructure, other kinds of infrastructure is more important in organizing people than ideology, how can we apply this learning or insight in the organizing that we do or the localities we're based in? So if you guys want to get into one more breakout of like small group, like 3 to 4 people, we could write it up on the board. Yeah. So the question is loosely, but y'all can kind of apply it in your context. Is this framework of competitive control, which I'm gonna write the definition for it up here. How does that apply as an insight or learning in the organizing that you're doing in the locality that you're based? And just to reshare the definition, the ideology actually is not the primary mode through which we invite people to join a movement. It's showing material incentives to combat instability and a predictable, consistent, and widespread spectrum of control. Okay, y'all, if y'all can bring it back to the group, I know that wasn't enough time, but
JMC, did you do the clap? It's moving quickly.
Clap once if you can hear me. Clap twice if you can hear me.
cool. Sorry we don't have more time to discuss, but I hope that these concepts are things that help us the next few days as well. Is there any like highlights that y'all want to share from your conversation? Like anything interesting that you reflected on together? Yeah.
Creating kind of community directories of who has what kind of skills, so you can so people with the skills needed are available for contact if there's like a power vacuum or like a if say police or some form of community safety measures are withdrawn by the state, to have people who are capable of de-escalation or meeting those needs available for contact readily.
Nice. Yeah, community directory so that in moments where there's a need, like community safety, for example, like is available to address that. Community safety groups. Is there anything else people want to share? Yeah.
I'm Arthur, everybody. I'll be talking about Rojava later in the week. So awesome, this presentation. What it made me think about is that in Syria, when a power vacuum arose in the middle of the civil war, like the cold hard truth is that when the Kurdish revolutionary movement first took action, beyond the places that it had actually established like a well-organized base that was ideologically on board already within the Kurdish community, the number one thing, we have this from like the very limited polling that exists about the Syrian civil war, the number one thing that got people to support the, what you want to call it, the PYD, the revolutionary movement, was security. It was not because they thought like the abstract ideology of Abdullah Öcalan was the greatest way to like forge a social life together. There was a group that was the most effective force on the ground at keeping people safe, at establishing stability. They had a plan. They seemed to have a structure of governance that people could participate in. And it was like brass tacks, like you're saying. So it's just another example to like reinforce the point that
Thank you so much for sharing that case study.
And they protected minorities. That's a huge part of it. Multi-ethnic society that had, sorry to interrupt, but like the equivalent of white supremacy's function here, which was Arab supremacy imposed by the old Ba'athist government. They protected in Rojava, in that territory, refugees from all over the country from all the different ethnic groups. And and that was a huge part of their legitimacy as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I feel like that's why I found it very interesting because actually the US military thinks about competitive control in its analysis. But we can too. So I want to wrap up soon, but really appreciate these conversations. And I think just the intervention that we wanted to make with that kind of conversation and kind of in how we're organizing is that in many ways, infrastructure and especially economic infrastructure is in many ways more important than ideology in movement building, especially when you think of crises and the crises that create vacuums of power that become filled by other kinds of people with other intents. How can we use these vacuums as spaces where we can show that we can also lead materially through crises? And kind of like that's something that we're grappling with and that we want to shape how we think about survival programs. So just to wrap up, I want to just end off on sharing about a case study that we're kind of like in collaboration with some farmers in the west side of Las Vegas and how they kind of demonstrate a lot of these concepts in their approach. And I just wanted to briefly share this case study as people we're collaborating with in Survival Bloc and kind of like to kind of wrap up and like share maybe an example of how these things can be concretely put into practice, although there are so many case studies that we can learn from. So the case study I wanted to talk about was Green Side Up Farms. So Green Side Up Farms is a group of Black farmers in the west side of Vegas. I don't know how familiar y'all are with the west side of Vegas. Yeah, most people don't know about the west side of Vegas. I learned about it recently too. But the west side of Vegas is a part of Vegas that is not talked about and is kind of like the part, it's an area that's right next to the strip in Las Vegas that has been economically divested from, extracted from. It's a predominantly Black and working class kind of part of Vegas. And it has faced so much of the impacts of the tourism industry. And I wanted to just share some work that we kind of went to kind of collaborate with them and scheme with them last week, actually, for a few days, and kind of learn from them and just wanted to use this moment to uplift what they're doing. So basically, these farmers are kind of in the condition of the West Side Vegas, which is one of the largest food deserts in the US. And the community entirely relies on external mechanisms of wealth, specifically charities, a lot of big charities that are coming in and doing like on house services and other kinds of services. These farmers who are very like revolutionary, they're basically building these vertical food hubs in the west side because obviously that's the context of farming that they're doing in those conditions with limited arable land and limited water sources. And they're building up these food hubs specifically in the west side of Vegas with the goal of building up economic self-determination for the community. And I think what's really interesting about their model is just three things that I want to share. One is what they're doing exposes the ecological limits of the capitalist system and takes advantage of the opportunities that crises create in highlighting the weaknesses of capitalism supply chains, specifically through the realm of agriculture. So every time Vegas is an extreme example, which is why I like it, of when they're kind of entirely reliant on importing food. They have very little farms around that area and in the region. And for example, a lot of what Green Side Up, they're producing is lettuce because I think it's like 70% of our lettuce comes from one part of California, and they were talking about that, like even they're importing that from there. And so they're building up these food hubs where they're going lettuce, for example, and even these bigger institutions, capitalist institutions, when moments of crises hit, like they were talking about how there's been some kind of crises that kind of like caused the highway to shut down, and the city didn't have food for a number of days, and they were kind of like struggling. And oh yeah, because of fires. And in those moments, like they're basically creating the system that's kind of getting ahead of the weaknesses of capitalism and producing for something like lettuce, for example. And then all these bigger kind of institutions are kind of gonna be reliant ultimately on them because they're kind of like leading in the realm of vertical food production, vertical farming and food production in Vegas. And they're trying to keep extending and building more and more food hubs so that in these moments of crisis, people are more and more reliant on actually their production, which I think is very interesting and smart and kind of gets at the concept of competitive control and specifically targeting the supply chains of agriculture, which I do think is a huge weakness in the capitalist system for the elite class. And I think that's very interesting. Also leading through crisis and showing the importance of economic infrastructure to show people in from West Side rather than ideology. They're building those food hubs first, and then they're kind of using them to politicize people, which I think is very important. Like they're meeting their material needs and then saying like, join the struggle. And they're also building fortification against the nonprofit industrial complex, which is one of the biggest threats to the working class residents of the West Side, because those big nonprofits are kind of capitalizing off the problem without addressing the root cause. And you see that in the West Side, there's big charities that are kind of running, and they're not addressing the actual material needs and like building up people from that basis. So they're kind of using this tactic of building economic engines to also fight the nonprofit industrial complex. So yeah, I just wanted to share that case study because it's one of the case studies we're building with Survival Bloc, and I hope it kind of plants an imagination of some of the things we're thinking about in the realm of like acknowledging the nonprofit industrial complex limitations on organizing, acknowledging material needs, leading through crises, and what that can look like. So I hope that made sense, and I'm gonna pass it to Daisy.
Thank you, Maria, for that. Gonna kind of get this space together. No, I got it. How's everyone feeling? We're almost done, I promise. But what I wanted to talk to you guys about is something that who was it that brought it up? You. Somebody brought it up around this sense of insulation, this sense of isolation, and whenever we do, we are posed with a crisis. That is somewhat the tendency, and so I think just to kind of ground us is that climate survival programs and social change and social transformation sounds really, really great. This is a beast of something to think through and implement. But I just really, really want to just highlight and emphasize the points around when we're talking about the climate crisis and essentially talking about social revolution, we're touching on the things that we know that we need to make material changes very quickly. There's also some part of addressing the way that we are emotionally impacted by our changing climate, as well as like what that does to our spirit, right? I think that we're all involved in work where we can share a lot of what is happening inside of us in this moment right now. But I think it's like really, really important to understand like how do we get there? How do we move past the horizon? How do we get over that mountain? And what I really want to talk to you guys about just briefly is embodied transformation. And that, the types of external changes that we're talking about first has to happen inside of us first. And that we can't build any of these climate survival programs. We can't build a social revolution until we revolutionize ourselves. And so, my cards. Yeah. And so I really want to just highlight a really, really fucked up statistic that just dropped last year. If you guys were familiar with the recent public health report that the U.S. Surgeon General dropped last year, highlighting what we called the epidemic of loneliness. All right. So basically, what we already know, we're all fucking depressed. We're all feel lonely. This is actually like a really, really popular, quite new phenomenon that humanity is facing. Where 1 out of 2, especially this is in America, by the way, but I'm sure that this has many implications across the globe. 1 out of 2 Americans specifically feel loss of community, loss of self, no sense of belonging in their community. Like, very specifically, we don't feel this with each other. And it makes me like really, really curious, like, if all of us are feeling this type of disconnection, I wonder what is the purpose of having meetings like this, you know? I wonder what is the purpose of like going back into our community, like going back and applying these learnings. Are we gonna still feel isolated and alone when we go home? It's similar, like, you know, we talk about a lot of like people attending direct actions, people going to the protest. And it creates this sort of environment and like where people do feel really united. People do really feel like they are within a community where they are aligned ideologically. And then when they leave, it's like none of that mattered. And I guess I really want to ask you all why. Like, really, really ask you, why do we feel so lonely, even in the midst of supposedly building community? If anyone has recently read that report or know about that report, or just like kind of processing what I'm telling you, like, what does that make you feel? Like, how is that landing for you? I know that it's like, duh, like, yeah, I feel that, but really, like, how are you processing that?
Heartbroken.
Heartbroken?
I was thinking about like how well the right actually is in some ways meeting people's need for belonging, and like they're winning that contest for how do we help folks feel part of something.
Yeah, the right already has a sense of belonging with one another and practicing it.
This is something we were actually talking about in our group, the first group we did, where if you feel burnt out in your community, then there's something wrong. Because our community should be healing, regenerative. We should be coming out of our community feeling good.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance, yeah. Good.
I think like a couple of things. One is that this like really widespread sense that like calling on someone to help you is like being a burden. And the crazy thing is like if you ask people, they'll always be like, oh yeah, I would totally help out my friends and like if they needed me. Like I would totally be there. Like of course I want to help. And we all do. We want to help. Humans are very social creatures. But people I think are often afraid to ask for what they need. And so like even when people are like, oh yeah, let me know if you need anything, or like I'm here if you need me, like that's concretely not very meaningful, because like unless you're like, hey, I'm available to do this specific thing for you. Do you need me to get food for you? Do you need to call? Do you need me to needs? Like do you need me to like all these sorts of things that somebody might need? And I think a lot of people if they're in crisis have a really hard time articulating what these things are.
Yeah.
I mean, even beyond that, I have found two things. People don't know how to face themselves, I guess is the best way to put it, especially newer organizers, and what that actually looks like. Beyond that, we don't have, in a lot of cases, structures in place. And we have a bad habit as movements of forgetting lessons that we have learned before. Like, for example, on Burnout, ACT UP had an entire wing of it that was dedicated to burnout. during the AIDS crisis, and we, on the whole, have just forgotten about it.
My favorite quote, I think Erica Woodland said this in Healing Justice Lineage, is forgetting is a tool of white supremacy. Yeah. Yeah. I'll go back into that, but at some point, but yeah. Over here.
Makes me think about it, just having conversations and making it a goal and a priority to create spaces that we want to be a part of, that are rejuvenating, but like having those discussions and learning how to build those spaces if they're not already there. But being specific about it.
We'll go to Mason.
I also think of the crisis of loneliness as a space of political and movement opportunity, because we live in one of the most intensely, socially isolated societies that has ever existed in human history, and I think that is like a unmet human need in the same way that lack of food and shelter are. And if our movement is able to build the kinds of community spaces that can provide that for people in a context that is building something more broadly emancipatory, people are going to come to it because we're hungry for it and are being deprived of it in the kind of society that we live in. And I agree with the person over here who said that the right taps into this, but they do it in a really twisted way of, they're using the crisis of loneliness to push people into their feelings of fear about other people, into their anger as like their motivating principle about the world that we live in. And I think there's a reason why that like particularly appeals or works on young men who lack community to live in. And I just think at the end of the day, the kind of community that our movement can offer is always going to be so much more fulfilling. But we need to, build up the basic infrastructure of getting people together and have friends and neighbors that we can talk to and rely on. That just is non-existent in most communities.
Yeah, and like that's a whole wormhole there of like, why are they targeting men? Like, why are they targeting all these people? There's just like a whole like thing you can get into there. Yeah, take maybe one or two more.
I feel like it's hugely related to being told that to be successful you should be living on your own, and that we need to come back to more communal living, which is discouraged by the system and the housing system and everything like that. But maybe this will come up in more discussions, but I feel like that shouldn't be forgotten, and that a lot of efforts to like build community in other spaces will only get us so far if we're still all living in really, single room apartments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think about identity politics as this yet another way in which we reinforce the fiction of like the individual, where our political substance, our substance of being, can be reduced to like what we are as an individual and the identity we are as an individual. It's like in the last 10 years, so much has come up in the form of like consciousness and movements, and like it feels as though identity politics was the initial framework to capture what that was, but it then brought us back into this like sense of like, well, who you are and what it means to be a person is to be a singular person with identity, and that then poses you, that then connotates the substance, meaning depth of being that you have and your place in a struggle as an individual. I think we're getting out of it, but we got kind of lost in it.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do one more, Jamesy.
I
Thanks,
think
Z.
this is really closely related to what Zachariah just said. I So we've been talking a lot about like the social causes of loneliness, and that's really important. And some people have mentioned that the right is better at it, which I'm not actually sure is true, but let's say for purposes of argument it is. If it is, I think that part of the reason why the right is better at it is because of the elephant that's in the room, which is the disposability and the hostility and the inquisitorial attitude with which we treat our, so at least what we describe as our comrades in a lot of left-wing spaces. And I think that, like, it's related to the kind of identity politics the Secretary is talking about, but I would label things slightly differently. I think that there's, the issues that motivate identity politics, the fact that different communities of different identities have issues that have to be addressed on their own terms because they're not going to magically be solved if you quote unquote do socialism. Like, that's real, right? Like, that's like Black liberation and Indigenous liberation in America. That's imperialism. That's gender liberation. And they go together with the other liberation, but like, getting healthcare doesn't solve that, right? Like, it's like it has to be like a connected struggle. But there are some versions of it that are like, if you disagree with a comrade, you're oppressing them because you don't have the right checkbox. And
We can't critique each other given one of analysis because then we're the bad person.
Exactly.
We're wrong because we're a threat.
So like that stuff, and the censorship and the purges and the like, like turning people into like non-people thing. I mean, beyond destroying our own thing, it actually makes lots of people outside of our groups, right? And I'm not talking about like, cis white males. I'm talking, although that is true of them, I'm talking about like people of color, queer people, right? Trans people, indigenous people, Black people outside of our political spaces are scared to enter them because that freaks them out too, even though theoretically these methods are supposed to protect marginalized people. So I think that this is like something that we have to come to a reckoning with in terms of thinking through what it would actually mean to have a caring, pluralistic community that people want to be a part of without throwing marginalized people under the bus. Without saying, okay, in order to appeal to everyone, we have to like be quiet about these issues that only affect some people. No. We want to talk about the issues, but we also want to give people space to grow and be like and become like better versions of themselves. So that's something we have to figure out. I don't know the answer to that. But.
Yeah. For time's sake, I'm gonna keep going. I really encourage you guys to continue talking because it's like heavy shit. But lately, I thank you all for those reflections. By the way, I think in order to get to the world we think is possible, there needs to be an embodied transformation. And I think that we can start understanding what that means from this point of like an internal revolution leads to an external revolution. I think that we can start understanding what that may look like or feel like within the body. And this is kind of when we want to talk about somatics, generative somatics, if you're familiar with that, which we'll go into in just a second. But really what I'm trying to get at is that there is an inextricable connection to trauma, to the climate crisis, and to capitalism. We, with each other, especially when a disaster hits. How many of y'all like get burnt out really easily? Yeah. How many of y'all like have hesitations when someone asks you to do something? Yeah. Like be in community. Hey, I need you to maybe go do a run. I need you to go do a grocery run for somebody. I need you to go give somebody a ride. That hesitation is a trauma response. Your body is being activated into an autonomic reaction. Autonomic, sorry. Basically, it's just a part of the nervous system that keeps your heartbeat going, keeps your organs working, digestion, those types of things. And this activates when we are under extreme stress and pressure and anxiety. And these are usually contexts, right, when you're in community where you feel like you're not supposed to actually feel that, right? And so we get this stress and this trauma response as it's preparing for a threat that is actually not present. And so what we see in our nonprofit spaces, in our organizing, is these states of trauma, which is why we can't go forward. We fight each other. We freeze when we need to make a decision. We basically fawn, which is somewhat like appeasement, where we actually go against an ideal that we believe is harmful to us, that we don't actually believe, and we just go along with something just because we feel like we can't overcome it. And something that probably what we've all been doing during this training is dissociating.
Say that.
You know? And so I say this, and when we talk about somatics, it's extremely important to understand what's happening with the body mind, with the internal workings of what's happening inside of you. Somatics, the Greek root is soma, which basically means the living organism in its wholeness. It's the closest word that we have that can actually describe our emotional body, our feelings, our tendencies, our spirit, right? And our soma, which they call it, which we also call it our shaping, is shaped by the environment that we are in. And so it's kind of like saying, how can we actually be in community with one another when our community is dominated by a capitalistic culture, which that is our shaping, you know? When we look at our environment, it's polluted, you know? There's so many things that harm us, and we take that into our shaping, you know? And so these are the things, and hopefully you're staying with me. These are the things that we are shaped by. These are our tendencies of disconnection, you know? Almost like it is almost cancerous. You know, we actually don't know how to be with one another, even when we are with one another. And that's so heartbreaking. And so I want to propose some practical ways forward of actually tying in some of these like organizing practices, some of these things where we can't do the things that we're talking about here until we get grounded of where we are individually. What is the shape that we want to create? Who do we need to be right now to meet this moment? Not 10 years from now. The earth is asking you to do it now. It's asking you to do it now. And so there is a process of embodied transformation that this is what it is over here. This is a model that was created by Stacey K. Haynes, if you're familiar with that name, a leading somatics practitioner, has been practicing since the 90s. Somatics is kind of like an offshoot of like body work therapy kind of stuff that doesn't actually have like a really clinical grounding in like the medical world. It's more so of a framework. And so ways that we actually can embody the things that we want, embody the world we want, is to move through these 3 phases of transformation. And so we first have building a somatic awareness. So actually getting clear of what are my tendencies, sitting with yourself. Why do I avoid running out in participating with my mutual aid group to gather groceries? Why do I isolate when I've been to a protest? Why do I isolate when I've read like a terrible CNN fucking like article about Palestine or, you know, stuff like that? Like, why do you do that? That's really important for building your somatic awareness. Then we move into somatic practices, which, by the way, I like to think of somatic awareness as kind of like reconditioning. We have to recondition the body and the spirit to actually move in like against the way that capitalism makes us move. And I like to think about it as like writing out like my daily schedule and looking at not at all of the times that I don't have to be in community. How can I recondition myself and my body to move in the way that I want it to? That's the way I like to think of it. Somatic practices, I like to think of it as like rehabilitation. You know, so maybe forming that mutual aid group, getting more involved with that mutual aid group, getting involved with some type of struggle, you know, can be a somatic practice, moving your body into it. And that helps to kind of like cool off the sting that you may feel when confronting some of those conditioned tendencies that you have, right? So somatic practices are really, really important. And also understanding like, where are you in these phases? You know, am I fighting right now? Am I freezing? Am I dissociating? You know, do I need to, I hate this bad thing. It's like meditation, you know, understanding like your window of tolerance. What do you have a capacity for? What do you not? This is where we practice boundaries. This is where we actually apply principles to the way that we want to move into the world. And they should be accepted by others that you're trying to build community with. And also somatic opening. I like to think of this as like a reconstruction kind of phase. So how do we take the things that we've become aware of and our practices into actually building the world we want to be in? This is a process of embodied transformation. And then it usually starts within the self. The more that we look outwards to the way we want it to be applied, you know, we need more people to do that. So you start with yourself, you practice with your friends and family, you practice in your community, you practice for the landscape, and then you practice for an overall spiritual imperative. I want to, really quick, I probably have no more time left. Yeah. But I wanted to like share like a practical solution and like a story. So in 2021, I founded a mutual aid organization called Rise and Shine in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And it was an offshoot of the work that I was doing originally with the Sunrise Movement. We really saw the importance of integrating mutual aid into building environmental and climate resiliency. And we started off doing more like mutual aid during COVID, and it kind of like moved into like, you know, some of like the everyday crises that people were experiencing. On December 11th in 2021, Bowling Green was hit with the EF4 tornado that killed 80 people in our community, and largely destabilized our economy. There's a lot of people that lived in Bowling Green that also lived on the outskirts that don't live there anymore. And it was really interesting during that time because, one, we saw the importance of building community infrastructure to handle that moment. FEMA and our local government did not show up the way that they needed to. There was incredibly terrible dissemination of information, lack of resources, and no one really able to handle the trauma of the moment and what would come after. Rise and Shine raised $15,000 for our community. And between 4 states, including New York, including Michigan, including places like that, we distribute over $30,000 worth of disaster supplies by ourselves with a team of 5 people. And so when we talk about actually building an infrastructure that can compete against the state, this is what we're talking about. And we only had 5 people, including like a really non-committal group of large volunteers to help get that started. But it also just goes to show you like what actually can happen if all of us were maybe there together. But what happened after all of that happened is that we lost our volunteers. We lost commitment from organizers because they were moving through these states. And there was no one and there was no structure that can help ground people in community. They went back into their homes. They isolated, you know. They really just dissociated from the issue at hand and kind of left it up to the government to handle the recovery efforts, which now we see that most of the state money that we received in Bowling Green went to a new design of our police department, which was given walls and infrastructure that could handle up to 150 mile per hour winds. And that wasn't implemented in any of the housing codes, any of the residential areas that were actually hit. And so we saw that disaster capitalism kind of moment happen. And after we did all of that organizing, I mean, the way that we were able to do that, which is like where this methodology called community scouting came up. And I would love to talk to people a little bit more about community scouting and go deeper into methodology of it. But essentially, it was exactly what we're talking about: is door-to-door, door knocking, building alternative modes of communication with our neighbors, research, mobilizing on a block level to get the things that we needed done. And so that is what is one of my proposals for some type of practical alternative solution, is this methodology of community scouting, which is actually one of our survival programs. Some elements of community scouting, and then we'll close up, is mutual aid, power building around mutual aid, developing alternative media and communication systems like zines, media, radio communication, I don't know if I said that, embodied leadership and reconditioning. So moving people, normal people, into understanding where are they in their trauma responses, their conditioned tendencies, how do they break through that and build leadership, base building and outreach, participatory action research, and team building and overall direct democracy and decision making. And so, yeah. Yeah, I don't know where I was gonna say something else, but I'm gonna shut up. But like, yeah, I just wanted to say that is that there's like also a deeper work that we need to do, and that this can't largely stay in the ideological sphere. We have to lead from an internal transformation. So help us out and do this shit with us.
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
Okay, literally, we have no time. We ran so over. I'm so sorry, y'all. But the one thing I wanted to say is we're very like an emerging network of collaborators, and we're looking for people to collaborate with in the bigger strategy, but also the specific survival programs we mentioned, food-based survival programs, scouting, other kinds of survival programs. And so just wanted to open that up and hope we can find people that are down to scheme with us. Okay.
Okay, yeah, y'all, thank you for sitting through this. Sorry we went over. Just want to say we still have, a lot more questions than answers. I hope that this was eye-opening for people so that we can start working on these things and asking these big picture questions and how we can refocus and become resilient and build our survival programs. And I just wanted to close out with a chant from Asada Shakur. I'm sure everybody knows it. Can everybody please stand up? We gotta get some energy. Some energy! Can I get a hell yeah? Okay, let's get these fists up, please. Fists up. And the next intensive, we're gonna have more black people here at the next one. Hopefully. Okay, so please repeat after me. These are the words from Asada. We have the duty to fight for our freedom. We have the duty to fight for our freedom. We have the duty to win. We have the duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We have nothing to lose but our chains. All right, thank you, everybody.